This video has been sponsored by The Great Courses Plus. You may know who they are, but if you don't, it's a service where you have instantaneous access to lectures by top professors. One of these lectures actually inspired the creation of this video, so stay tuned till the end of the video to find out more. While various types of soldiers throughout history are often romanticized, few are more adored than the medieval knight. Our conventional idea of knights existed during the High Middle Ages, that's around the 11th to 14th centuries, although knights rode across battlefields well before 1000 AD. So by removing the myth and glamour that society has put on these past soldiers, let's answer a few questions. Why were knights needed? What were their lives even like? The most important thing to understand about knights is that they were not just warriors in heavy armor riding on horseback. Sure, that would be a pretty accurate description, but at the same time, knighthood was about more than just being a soldier. Being a knight solidified your place in society. While the social classes of the Middle Ages are often grossly oversimplified, that could be another story, they were not nearly as complex as our modern society. So to sum it up, in this medieval society, you could be a worker, a member of the church, or a fighter. If your purpose was with the military, you had a level of nobility. Nobles ranged from kings and queens at the top to knights at the bottom. Landowning knights had a better standing than knights living in another man's castle or on another man's land, but even the lowliest knights had a certain level of respect granted due to this nobility. I mean, at least they weren't peasants. The origins of knights date back to the days of Charlemagne, and arguably the Roman Empire. Before the First Crusade, all fighters on horseback were knights. It wasn't a well-regarded status symbol, just a name. In fact, it would be perceived as disrespectful to call a high-ranking member of society a knight. Any horseback soldier could identify as a knight, and no benefits came from this title. You don't need to be born into nobility, just a soldier with a horse. This would change as the Middle Ages progressed, especially by the High Middle Ages. The Catholic Church had previously held contempt for battle and war for clergy members, since, killing is in fact a sin. At first, the church would use outside factions and fighters for protection and whatnot, but lack of devotion and other disagreements made these secular warriors inadequate. As protection became increasingly more important for small areas, such as housing for the poor, a new fighting force was needed. This would come with soldiers knighted by lords and kings. They would be an inclusive group. Random citizens would not often be considered for knighthood, although it wasn't impossible. Instead, knights were usually the firstborn son of a previous knight. This gave a certain level of weight to the status and legacy to the title, and made sure the class order wasn't dissolved. They fought for the church and held this in high regard. After all, religion and politics was one and the same in Europe at this time, and knights had a place in society never replicated by succeeding warriors. Knighthood was held to a high standard. A code of chivalry would dictate how they would act at all times. Included in this were the expectation of courtesy, honor, truth, and fighting for those who cannot protect themselves. Ideally, this should have been followed by all knights, but as this is human nature, not all followed the code. Chivalry also functioned as a standard of morality for the fighters. Rather than fight for personal wealth, fame, or glory, battles would be for the church, and what was to be perceived as the greater good. Again, this was not a rule followed by all knights, but it was a nice idea. So what was a standard knight like? First, what everyone cares about, the tools. They were armored in a layer of cloth, followed by chainmail and a tunic. This is overly simplified, but over the centuries, knight armor would gradually become more plated to deal with arrow fire. The helmets would vary from location to location, but the narrow visors traded visibility for protection. The primary fighting style of the knight was to lance, aka stab, an opponent on horseback. A horse could travel over 40 miles an hour, so the momentum of the horse combined with the long weapon could easily pierce armor and result in a kill. This was a skilled craft, and was one of the largest variables differing a knight from a civilian fighter. Swords and shield combat knowledge was also a necessity, but it would be preferable to stay on horseback, away from most of the danger. Wealthy knights would put armor on their horses, just for protection from those arrows that could easily kill your trusty steed. In the chaos of battle, identifying an individual knight would be nearly impossible from sight alone, so the coat of arms was introduced. Coat of arms would follow standards of heraldry and identify a knight and all of their kin. To follow this, last names developed in Europe to identify nobles with ease. a last name would endow you with rights and class placement. So, what would a knight's training look like? Well, if you fit the criteria explained earlier, you would be sent to a castle, raised by a foster parent for several years, and at the age of 7, you would become a page. You would learn basic training skills in hunting, courtesy, and maintenance of equipment. At 14, you would become a squire and earn a sword. You would become proficient at fighting, riding a horse, and fight alongside a knight. By 21, you would be able to earn your knighthood. In this event, the lord or king would give you the title of knight and place his sword upon your head and neck. This tradition represents how his power could kill you with ease. This is a pretty good representation of knighthood in general. Being a knight was a lifestyle, and death was a common occupational hazard. During peace times, knights would take part in tournaments, generally a massive public affair. The knight would take part in fighting another knight. The banner would bear the coat of arms, and a knight would be responsible for maintaining the honor of himself and his family name. The tournament would begin with a joust. 2 knights would mount their horse and charge at each other with a lance. If one is hit, they may be knocked off or killed. A joust can turn into a grounded fight with specified weapons and rules. In the result of a knight losing, the winner can choose whether to kill him or not. Acting within the codes of chivalry, a knight would not kill his opponent, but again, this wasn't always a guarantee. Tournaments were actually frowned upon by the church, who wanted to forbid them, but their popularity made this impossible. Tournaments were a brilliant sport to the spectator, with some very high stakes for the loser. As the years progressed and technology improved, the era of the knight had come to a close. Bows and crossbows had made the techniques of the knight far less practical, and had allowed far less skilled fighters to compete and win. Archery had become recreational to many, so there were plenty of soldiers capable with a bow. As guns became more commonplace on the battlefield, the knight was phased out entirely. In the modern day, the perception of knights is often skewed. The lives they led were not like the romanticized fiction we have become accustomed to. In reality, knighthood was not necessarily a privilege or a burden, it was just a way of life. This video was inspired by a lecture which was featured in the video service The Great Courses Plus, the High Middle Ages taught by Professor Philip DeLeader. Here he detailed the culture of High Middle Age Europe, including the Society of the Knights. I would really recommend it. You can access this and many other courses through the Great Courses Plus. It's a subscription on-demand video learning service with over 7,000 video lectures taught by professors in basically every field. Topics like science, history, math, and even really specific and odd topics that continue to always be updated, like photography. Courses are sometimes even hosted by National Geographic and the Smithsonian. If you don't like college, mostly because of the grades, this is pretty much like that. Remove the pressure of failure. Just watch and listen. So if you want to learn more about knights, click on this link to get 1 month of unlimited access to courses and videos absolutely free. Just visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/knowledge. The link is provided in the description below. This is Cody of Knowledge Hub.